Vladimir Lenin's left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. Several conclusions. The Russian bourgeois revolution of 1905 revealed a highly original turn in world history. In one of the most backward capitalist countries, the strike movement attained a scope and power unprecedented anywhere in the world. In the first month of 1905 alone, the number of strikers was 10 times the annual average for the previous decade, 1895 to 1904. From January to October 1905, strikes grew all the time and reached enormous proportions. Under the influence of a number of unique historical conditions, backward Russia was the first to show the world, not only the growth, by leaps and bounds, of the independent activity of the oppressed masses in time of revolution. This had occurred in all great revolutions, but also that the significance of the proletariat is infinitely greater than its proportion in the total population. It showed a combination of the economic strike and the political strike, with the latter developing into an armed uprising, and the birth of the Soviets, a new form of mass struggle and mass organization of the classes oppressed by capitalism. The revolutions of February and October 1917 led to the all-round development of the Soviets on a nationwide scale and to their victory in the proletarian socialist revolution. In less than 2 years, the international character of the Soviets, the spread of this form of struggle and organization to the world working class movement and the historical mission of the Soviets as the gravedigger, heir and successor of bourgeois parliamentarism and of bourgeois democracy in general, all became clear. But that is not all. The history of the working class movement now shows that, in all countries, it is about to go through, and is already going through, a struggle waged by communism, emergent, gaining strength and advancing towards victory, against, primarily, Menshevism, that is, opportunism and social chauvinism, the home brand in each particular country, and then as a complement, so to say, left-wing communism. The former struggle has developed in all countries, apparently without any exception, as a duel between the Second International, already virtually dead, and the Third International. The latter struggle is to be seen in Germany, Great Britain, Italy, America, at any rate, a certain section of the industrial workers of the world and of the anarcho-syndicalist trends uphold the errors of left-wing communism alongside of an almost universal and almost unreserved acceptance of the Soviet system, and in France, the attitude of a section of the former syndicalists towards the political party and parliamentarism, also alongside of the acceptance of the Soviet system. In other words, the struggle is undoubtedly being waged, not only on an international, but even on a worldwide scale. But while the working class movement is everywhere going through what is actually the same kind of preparatory school for victory over the bourgeoisie, it is achieving the development in its own way in each country. The big and advanced capitalist countries are traveling this road far more rapidly than did Bolshevism, to which history granted 15 years to prepare itself for victory, as an organized political trend. In the brief space of a year, the Third International has already scored a decisive victory. It has defeated the yellow, social chauvinist Second International, which only a few months ago was incomparably stronger than the Third International, seemed stable and powerful, and enjoyed every possible support, direct and indirect, material, cabinet posts, passports, the press, and ideological, from the world bourgeoisie. It is now essential that communists of every country should quite consciously take into account both the fundamental objectives of the struggle against opportunism and left doctrinarism, and the concrete features which this struggle assumes and must inevitably assume in each country, in conformity with the specific character of its economics, politics, culture, and national composition, Ireland, etc., its colonies, religious divisions, and so on and so forth. Dissatisfaction with the Second International is felt everywhere and is spreading and growing, both because of its opportunism and because of its inability or incapacity to create a really centralized and really leading center capable of directing the international tactics of the revolutionary proletariat in its struggle for a world Soviet republic. It should be clearly realized that such a leading center can never be built up on stereotyped, mechanically equated, and identical tactical rules of struggle. As long as national and state distinctions exist among peoples and countries, and these will continue to exist for a very long time to come, even after the dictatorship of the proletariat has been established on a worldwide scale. The unity of the international tactics of the communist working class movement in all countries demands, not the elimination of variety or the suppression of national distinctions, which is a pipe dream at present, but an application of the fundamental principles of communism, Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will correctly modify these principles in certain particulars, correctly adapt and apply them to national and national state distinctions. To seek out, investigate, predict, and grasp that which is nationally specific and nationally distinctive, in the concrete manner in which each country should tackle a single international task, victory over opportunism and left doctrinarism within the working class movement, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the establishment of a Soviet republic and a proletarian dictatorship, such is the basic task in the historical period that all the advanced countries, and not they alone, are going through. The chief thing, though, of course, far from everything, the chief thing, has already been achieved. The vanguard of the working class has been won over, has ranged itself on the side of Soviet government and against parliamentarism, on the side of the dictatorship of the proletariat and against bourgeois democracy. All efforts and all attention should now be concentrated on the next step, which may seem, and from a certain viewpoint actually is less fundamental, but, on the other hand, is actually closer to a practical accomplishment of the task. That step is, the search after forms of the transition or the approach to the proletarian revolution. The proletarian vanguard has been won over ideologically. That is the main thing. Without this, not even the first step towards victory can be made. But that is still quite a long way from victory. Victory cannot be won with a vanguard alone. To throw only the vanguard into the decisive battle, before the entire class, the broad masses, have taken up a position either of direct support for the vanguard, or at least of sympathetic neutrality towards it and of precluded support for the enemy, would be, not merely foolish but criminal. Propaganda and agitation alone are not enough for an entire class, the broad masses of the working people, those oppressed by capital, to take up such a stand. For that, the masses must have their own political experience. Such is the fundamental law of all great revolutions, which has been confirmed with compelling force and vividness, not only in Russia but in Germany as well. To turn resolutely towards communism, it was necessary, not only for the ignorant and often illiterate masses of Russia, but also for the literate and well-educated masses of Germany, to realize from their own bitter experience the absolute impotence and spinelessness, the absolute helplessness and servility to the bourgeoisie, and the utter vileness of the government of the paladins of the Second International. They had to realize that a dictatorship of the extreme reactionaries, Kornilov, 37, in Russia, Kapp, 38, and company in Germany, is inevitably the only alternative to a dictatorship of the proletariat. The immediate objective of the class-conscious vanguard of the international working class movement, that is, the communist parties, groups and trends, is to be able to lead the broad masses, who are still, for the most part, apathetic, inert, dormant and convention-ridden, to their new position, or, rather, to be able to lead, not only their own party but also these masses in their advance and transition to the new position. While the first historical objective, that of winning over the class-conscious vanguard of the proletariat to the side of Soviet power and the dictatorship of the working class, could not have been reached without a complete ideological and political victory over opportunism and social chauvinism, the second and immediate objective, which consists in being able to lead the masses to a new position ensuring the victory of the vanguard in the revolution, cannot be reached without the liquidation of left doctrinarism, and without a full elimination of its errors. As long as it was, and inasmuch as it still is, a question of winning the proletariat's vanguard over to the side of communism, priority went and still goes to propaganda work. Even propaganda circles, with all their parochial limitations, are useful under these conditions, and produce good results. But when it is a question of practical action by the masses, of the disposition, if one may so put it, of vast armies, of the alignment of all the class forces in a given society for the final and decisive battle, then propagandist methods alone, the mere repetition of the truths of pure communism, are of no avail. In these circumstances, one must not count in thousands, like the propagandist belonging to a small group that has not yet given leadership to the masses. In these circumstances one must count in millions and tens of millions. In these circumstances, we must ask ourselves, not only whether we have convinced the vanguard of the revolutionary class, but also whether the historically effective forces of all classes, positively of all the classes in a given society, without exception, are arrayed in such a way that the decisive battle is at hand, in such a way that, 1. All the class forces hostile to us have become sufficiently entangled, are sufficiently at loggerheads with each other, have sufficiently weakened themselves in a struggle which is beyond their strength. 2. All the vacillating and unstable, intermediate elements, the petty bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeois democrats, as distinct from the bourgeoisie, have sufficiently exposed themselves in the eyes of the people, have sufficiently disgraced themselves through their practical bankruptcy, and, 3. Among the proletariat, a mass sentiment favoring the most determined, bold and dedicated revolutionary action against the bourgeoisie has emerged and begun to grow vigorously. Then revolution is indeed ripe, then, indeed, if we have correctly gauged all the conditions indicated and summarized above, and if we have chosen the right moment, our victory is assured. The differences between the Churchills and the Lloyd Georges with insignificant national distinctions, these political types exist in all countries, on the one hand, and between the Hendersons and the Lloyd Georges on the other, are quite minor and unimportant from the standpoint of pure, that is, abstract, communism, that is, communism that has not yet matured to the stage of practical political action by the masses. However, from the standpoint of this practical action by the masses, these differences are most important. To take due account of these differences, and to determine the moment when the inevitable conflicts between these friends, which weaken and enfeeble all the friends taken together, will have come to a head, that is the concern, the task, of a communist who wants to be, not merely a class-conscious and convinced propagandist of ideas, but a practical leader of the masses in the revolution. It is necessary to link the strictest devotion to the ideas of communism with the ability to effect all the necessary practical compromises, tacks, conciliatory maneuvers, zigzags, retreats and so on, in order to speed up the achievement and then loss of political power by the Hendersons, the heroes of the Second International, if we are not to name individual representatives of petty bourgeois democracy who call themselves socialists, to accelerate their inevitable bankruptcy in practice, which will enlighten the masses in the spirit of our ideas, in the direction of communism, to accelerate the inevitable friction, quarrels, conflicts and complete disintegration among the Hendersons, the Lloyd Georges and the Churchills, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Constitutional Democrats, the Monarchists, the Sidemans, the bourgeoisie and the Coppists, etc., to select the proper moment when the discord among these pillars of sacrosanct private property is at its height, so that, through a decisive offensive, the proletariat will defeat them all and capture political power. History as a whole, and the history of revolutions in particular, is always richer in content, more varied, more multiform, more lively and ingenious than is imagined by even the best parties, the most class-conscious vanguards of the most advanced classes. This can readily be understood, because even the finest of vanguards express the class consciousness, will, passion and imagination of tens of thousands, whereas at moments of great upsurge in the exertion of all human capacities, revolutions are made by the class consciousness, will, passion and imagination of tens of millions, spurred on by a most acute struggle of classes. Two very important practical conclusions follow from this. First, that in order to accomplish its task the revolutionary class must be able to master all forms or aspects of social activity without exception, completing after the capture of political power, sometimes at great risk and with very great danger, what it did not complete before the capture of power. Second, that the revolutionary class must be prepared for the most rapid and brusque replacement of one form by another. One will readily agree that any army which does not train to use all the weapons, all the means and methods of warfare that the enemy possesses, or may possess, is behaving in an unwise or even criminal manner. This applies to politics even more than it does to the art of war. In politics it is even harder to know in advance which methods of struggle will be applicable and to our advantage in certain future conditions. Unless we learn to apply all the methods of struggle, we may suffer grave and sometimes even decisive defeat, if changes beyond our control in the position of the other classes bring to the forefront a form of activity in which we are especially weak. If, however, we learn to use all the methods of struggle, victory will be certain, because we represent the interests of the really foremost and really revolutionary class, even if circumstances do not permit us to make use of weapons that are most dangerous to the enemy, weapons that deal the swiftest mortal blows. Inexperienced revolutionaries often think that legal methods of struggle are opportunist because, in this field, the bourgeoisie has most frequently deceived and duped the workers, particularly in peaceful and non-revolutionary times, while illegal methods of struggle are revolutionary. That, however, is wrong. The truth is that those parties and leaders are opportunists and traitors to the working class that are unable or unwilling, do not say, I can't, say, I shan't, to use illegal methods of struggle in conditions such as those which prevailed, for example, during the imperialist war of 1914–18, when the bourgeoisie of the freest democratic countries most brazenly and brutally deceived the workers, and smothered the truth about the predatory character of the war. But revolutionaries who are incapable of combining illegal forms of struggle with every form of legal struggle are poor revolutionaries indeed. It is not difficult to be a revolutionary when revolution has already broken out and is in spate, when all people are joining the revolution just because they are carried away, because it is the vogue, and sometimes even from careerist motives. After its victory, the proletariat has to make most strenuous efforts, even the most painful, so as to liberate itself from such pseudo-revolutionaries. It is far more difficult, and far more precious, to be a revolutionary when the conditions for direct, open, really mass and really revolutionary struggle do not yet exist, to be able to champion the interests of the revolution, by propaganda, agitation and organization, in non-revolutionary bodies, and quite often in downright reactionary bodies, in a non-revolutionary situation, among the masses who are incapable of immediately appreciating the need for revolutionary methods of action. To be able to seek, find and correctly determine the specific path or the particular turn of events that will lead the masses to the real, decisive and final revolutionary struggle, such is the main objective of communism in Western Europe and in America today. Britain is an example. We cannot tell, no one can tell in advance, how soon a real proletarian revolution will flare up there, and what immediate cause will most serve to rouse, kindle, and impel into the struggle the very wide masses, who are still dormant. Hence, it is our duty to carry on all our preparatory work in such a way as to be well shod on all 4 feet, as the late Plekhanov, when he was a Marxist and revolutionary, was fond of saying. It is possible that the breach will be forced, the ice broken, by a parliamentary crisis, or by a crisis arising from colonial and imperialist contradictions, which are hopelessly entangled and are becoming increasingly painful and acute, or perhaps by some third cause, etc. We are not discussing the kind of struggle that will determine the fate of the proletarian revolution in Great Britain. No communist has any doubt on that score. For all of us this is a foregone conclusion. What we are discussing is the immediate cause that will bring into motion the now dormant proletarian masses, and lead them right up to revolution. Let us not forget that in the French bourgeois republic, for example, in a situation which, from both the international and the national viewpoints, was 100 times less revolutionary than it is today, such an unexpected and petty cause as one of the many thousands of fraudulent machinations of the reactionary military caste, the Dreyfus case, 39, was enough to bring the people to the brink of civil war. In Great Britain the communists should constantly, unremittingly and unswervingly utilize parliamentary elections and all the vicissitudes of the Irish, colonial and world imperialist policy of the British government, and all other fields, spheres and aspects of public life, and work in all of them in a new way, in a communist way, in the spirit of the Third, not the Second, International. I have neither the time nor the space here to describe the Russian Bolshevik methods of participation in parliamentary elections and in the parliamentary struggle. I can, however, assure foreign communists that they were quite unlike the usual West European parliamentary campaigns. From this the conclusion is often drawn, well, that was in Russia. In our country parliamentarianism is different. This is a false conclusion. Communists, adherents of the Third International in all countries, exist for the purpose of changing, all along the line, in all spheres of life, the old socialist, trade unionist, syndicalist, and parliamentary type of work into a new type of work, the communist. In Russia, too, there was always an abundance of opportunism, purely bourgeois sharp practices and capitalist rigging in the elections. In Western Europe and in America, the communist must learn to create a new, uncustomary, non-opportunist, and non-careerist parliamentarianism. The communist parties must issue their slogans, true proletarians, with the help of the unorganized and downtrodden poor, should distribute leaflets, canvass workers' houses and cottages of the rural proletarians and peasants in the remote villages. Fortunately there are many times fewer remote villages in Europe than in Russia, and in Britain the number is very small. They should go into the public houses, penetrate into unions, societies and chance gatherings of the common people, and speak to the people, not in learned, or very parliamentary, language. They should not at all strive to get seats in parliament, but should everywhere try to get people to think, and draw the masses into the struggle, to take the bourgeoisie at its word and utilize the machinery it has set up, the elections it has appointed, and the appeals it has made to the people. They should try to explain to the people what Bolshevism is, in a way that was never possible, under bourgeois rule, outside of election times, exclusive, of course, of times of big strikes, when in Russia a similar apparatus for widespread popular agitation worked even more intensively. It is very difficult to do this in Western Europe and extremely difficult in America, but it can and must be done, for the objectives of communism cannot be achieved without effort. We must work to accomplish practical tasks, ever more varied and ever more closely connected with all branches of social life, winning branch after branch, and sphere after sphere from the bourgeoisie. In Great Britain, further, the work of propaganda, agitation and organization among the armed forces and among the oppressed and underprivileged nationalities in their own state, Ireland, the colonies, must also be tackled in a new fashion, one that is not socialist, but communist, not reformist, but revolutionary. That is because, in the era of imperialism in general and especially today after a war that was a sore trial to the peoples and has quickly opened their eyes to the truth, that is, the fact that tens of millions were killed and maimed for the sole purpose of deciding whether the British or the German robbers should plunder the largest number of countries, all these spheres of social life are heavily charged with inflammable material and are creating numerous causes of conflicts, crises and an intensification of the class struggle. We do not and cannot know which spark, of the innumerable sparks that are flying about in all countries as a result of the world economic and political crisis, will kindle the conflagration. In the sense of raising up the masses, we must, therefore, with our new and communist principles, set to work to stir up all and sundry, even the oldest, mustiest and seemingly hopeless fears, for otherwise we shall not be able to cope with our tasks, shall not be comprehensively prepared, shall not be in possession of all the weapons and shall not prepare ourselves either to gain victory over the bourgeoisie, which arranged all aspects of social life, and has now disarranged them, in its bourgeois fashion, or to bring about the impending communist reorganization of every sphere of life, following that victory. Since the proletarian revolution in Russia and its victories on an international scale, expected neither by the bourgeoisie nor the Philistines, the entire world has become different, and the bourgeoisie everywhere has become different too. It is terrified of Bolshevism, exasperated by it almost to the point of frenzy, and for that very reason it is, on the one hand, precipitating the progress of events and, on the other, concentrating on the forcible suppression of Bolshevism, thereby weakening its own position in a number of other fields. In their tactics the communists in all the advanced countries must take both these circumstances into account. when the Russian cadets and Kerensky began furiously to hound the Bolsheviks, especially since April 1917, and more particularly in June and July 1917, they overdid things. Millions of copies of bourgeois papers, clamoring in every key against the Bolsheviks, helped the masses to make an appraisal of Bolshevism. Apart from the newspapers, all public life was full of discussions about Bolshevism, as a result of the bourgeoisie's zeal. Today the millionaires of all countries are behaving on an international scale in a way that deserves our heartiest thanks. They are hounding Bolshevism with the same zeal as Kerensky and company did. They, too, are overdoing things and helping us just as Kerensky did. When the French bourgeoisie makes Bolshevism the central issue in the elections, and accuses the comparatively moderate or vacillating socialists of being Bolsheviks, when the American bourgeoisie, which has completely lost its head, seizes thousands and thousands of people on suspicion of Bolshevism, creates an atmosphere of panic, and broadcasts stories of Bolshevik plots, when, despite all its wisdom and experience, the British bourgeoisie, the most solid in the world, makes incredible blunders, founds richly endowed anti-Bolshevik societies, creates a special literature on Bolshevism, and recruits an extra number of scientists, agitators and clergymen to combat it, we must salute and thank the capitalists. They are working for us. They are helping us to get the masses interested in the essence and significance of Bolshevism, and they cannot do otherwise, for they have already failed to ignore Bolshevism and stifle it. But at the same time, the bourgeoisie sees practically only one aspect of Bolshevism: insurrection, violence, and terror. It therefore strives to prepare itself for resistance and opposition primarily in this field. It is possible that, in certain instances, in certain countries, and for certain brief periods, it will succeed in this. We must reckon with such an eventuality, and we have absolutely nothing to fear if it does succeed. Communism is emerging in positively every sphere of public life. Its beginnings are to be seen literally on all sides. The contagion, to use the favorite metaphor of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois police, though one mostly to their liking, has very thoroughly penetrated the organism and has completely permeated it. If special efforts are made to block one of the channels, the contagion will find another one, sometimes very unexpectedly. Life will assert itself. Let the bourgeoisie rave, work itself into a frenzy, go to extremes, commit follies, take vengeance on the Bolsheviks in advance, and endeavor to kill off, as in India, Hungary, Germany, etc., more hundreds, thousands, and hundreds of thousands of yesterday's and tomorrow's Bolsheviks. In acting thus, the bourgeoisie is acting as all historically doomed classes have done. Communists should know that, in any case, the future belongs to them. Therefore, we can, and must, combine the most intense passion in the great revolutionary struggle, with the coolest and most sober appraisal of the frenzied ravings of the bourgeoisie. The Russian Revolution was cruelly defeated in 1905, the Russian Bolsheviks were defeated in July 1917, over 15,000 German communists were killed as a result of the wily provocation and cunning maneuvers of Seidman and Nusk, who were working hand in glove with the bourgeoisie and the monarchist generals. White terror is raging in Finland and Hungary. But in all cases in all countries, communism is becoming steeled and is growing. Its roots are so deep that persecution does not weaken or debilitate it but only strengthens it. Only one thing is lacking to enable us to march forward more confidently and firmly to victory, namely, the universal and thorough awareness of all communists in all countries of the necessity to display the utmost flexibility in their tactics. The communist movement, which is developing magnificently, now lacks, especially in the advanced countries, this awareness and the ability to apply it in practice. That which happened to such leaders of the Second International, such highly erudite Marxists devoted to socialism as Kautsky, Otto Bauer and others, could, and should, provide a useful lesson. They fully appreciated the need for flexible tactics, they themselves learned Marxist dialectic and taught it to others, and much of what they have done in this field will always remain a valuable contribution to socialist literature. However, in the application of this dialectic they committed such an error, or proved to be so undialectical in practice, so incapable of taking into account the rapid change of forms and the rapid acquisition of new content by the old forms, that their fate is not much more enviable than that of Hyndman, Gst, and Plekhanov. The principal reason for their bankruptcy was that they were hypnotized by a definite form of growth of the working class movement and socialism, forgot all about the one-sidedness of that form, were afraid to see the breakup which objective conditions made inevitable, and continued to repeat simple and, at first glance, incontestable axioms that had been learned by rote, like, 3 is more than 2. But politics is more like algebra than like arithmetic, and still more like higher than elementary mathematics. In reality, all the old forms of the socialist movement have acquired a new content, and, consequently, a new symbol, the minus sign, has appeared in front of all the figures. Our wiseacres, however, have stubbornly continued, and still continue, to persuade themselves and others that -3 is more than -2. We must see to it that communists do not make a similar mistake, only in the opposite sense, or rather, we must see to it that a similar mistake, only made in the opposite sense by the left communists, is corrected as soon as possible and eliminated as rapidly and painlessly as possible. It is not only right doctrinarism that is erroneous, left doctrinarism is erroneous too. Of course, the mistake of left doctrinarism in communism is at present 1,000 times less dangerous and less significant than that of right doctrinarism, that is, social chauvinism and Trotskyism, but, after all, that is only due to the fact that left communism is a very young trend, is only just coming into being. It is only for this reason that, under certain conditions, the disease can be easily eradicated, and we must set to work with the utmost energy to eradicate it. The old forms burst asunder, for it turned out that their new content, anti-proletarian and reactionary, had attained an inordinate development. From the standpoint of the development of international communism, our work today has such a durable and powerful content, for Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, that it can and must manifest itself in any form, both new and old. It can and must regenerate, conquer and subjugate all forms, not only the new, but also the old, not for the purpose of reconciling itself with the old, but for the purpose of making all and every form, new and old, a weapon for the complete and irrevocable victory of communism. The communists must exert every effort to direct the working class movement and social development in general along the straightest and shortest road to the victory of Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat on a worldwide scale. That is an incontestable truth. But it is enough to take one little step farther, a step that might seem to be in the same direction, and truth turns into error. We have only to say, as the German and British left communists do, that we recognize only one road, only the direct road, and that we will not permit tacking, conciliatory maneuvers, or compromising, and it will be a mistake which may cause, and in part has already caused and is causing, very grave prejudices to communism. Right doctrinarism persisted in recognizing only the old forms, and became utterly bankrupt, for it did not notice the new content. Left doctrinarism persists in the unconditional repudiation of certain old forms, failing to see that the new content is forcing its way through all and sundry forms, that it is our duty as communists to master all forms, to learn how, with the maximum rapidity, to supplement one form with another, to substitute one for another, and to adapt our tactics to any such change that does not come from our class or from our efforts. World revolution has been so powerfully stimulated and accelerated by the horrors, vileness and abominations of the world imperialist war and by the hopelessness of the situation created by it. This revolution is developing in scope and depth with such splendid rapidity, with such a wonderful variety of changing forms, with such an instructive practical refutation of all doctrinarism, that there is every reason to hope for a rapid and complete recovery of the international communist movement from the infantile disorder of left-wing communism. Appendix. Before publishing houses in our country, which has been plundered by the imperialists of the whole world in revenge for the proletarian revolution, and which is still being plundered and blockaded by them regardless of all promises they made to their workers, were able to bring out my pamphlet, additional material arrived from abroad. Without claiming to present in my pamphlet anything more than the cursory notes of a publicist, I shall dwell briefly upon a few points. The split among the German Communists. The split among the Communists in Germany is an accomplished fact. The lefts, or the opposition on principle, have formed a separate Communist Workers' Party, as distinct from the Communist Party. A split also seems imminent in Italy. I say seems, as I have only two additional issues, Nos. 7 and 8, of the left newspaper, Il Soviet, in which the possibility of and necessity for a split is openly discussed, and mention is also made of a Congress of the abstentionist group, or the boycottists, that is, opponents of participation in Parliament, which group is still part of the Italian Socialist Party. There is reason to fear that the split with the lefts, the anti-parliamentarians, in part anti-politicals too, who are opposed to any political party and to work in the trade unions, will become an international phenomenon, like the split with the centrists, that is, Trotskyites, Lungatists, independents, etc. Let that be so. At all events, a split is better than confusion, which hampers the ideological, theoretical and revolutionary growth and maturing of the party, and its harmonious, really organized practical work which actually paves the way for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Let the lefts put themselves to a practical test on a national and international scale. Let them try to prepare for, and then implement, the dictatorship of the proletariat, without a rigorously centralized party with iron discipline, without the ability to become masters of every sphere, every branch, and every variety of political and cultural work. Practical experience will soon teach them. Only, every effort should be made to prevent the split with the left from impeding, or to see that it impedes as little as possible, the necessary amalgamation into a single party, inevitable in the near future, of all participants in the working class movement who sincerely and conscientiously stand for Soviet government and the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was the exceptional good fortune of the Bolsheviks in Russia to have had 15 years for a systematic and consummated struggle both against the Mensheviks, that is, the opportunists and centrists, and against the lefts, long before the masses began direct action for the dictatorship of the proletariat. In Europe and America the same work has now to be done by forced marches, so to say. Certain individuals, especially among unsuccessful aspirants to leadership, may, if they lack proletarian discipline and are not honest towards themselves, persist in their mistakes for a long time. However, when the time is ripe, the masses of the workers will themselves unite easily and rapidly and unite all sincere communists to form a single party capable of establishing the Soviet system and the dictatorship of the proletariat. 9. 2. The Communists and the Independents in Germany. In this pamphlet I have expressed the opinion that a compromise between the Communists and the left wing of the Independents is necessary and useful to communism, but it will not be easy to bring about. Newspapers which I have subsequently received have confirmed this opinion on both points. Number 32 of the Red Flag, organ of the Central Committee, the Communist Party of Germany, Die Rot von, Zentralorgan der Kommunistischen Partei Deutschlands, Spartakusbund, of March 26, 1920, published a statement by the Central Committee regarding the Kaplowitz military putsch and on the socialist government. This statement is quite correct both in its basic premise and its practical conclusions. The basic premise is that at present there is no objective basis for the dictatorship of the proletariat because the majority of the urban workers support the independents. The conclusion is, a promise to be a loyal opposition, that is, renunciation of preparations for a forcible overthrow, to a socialist government if it excludes bourgeois capitalist parties. In the main, this tactic is undoubtedly correct. Yet, even if minor inaccuracies of formulation should not be dwelt on, it is impossible to pass over in silence the fact that a government consisting of social traitors should not, in an official statement by the Communist Party, be called socialist, that one should not speak of the exclusion of bourgeois capitalist parties, when the parties both of the Siedemans and of the Trotskys and Crispians are petty bourgeois democratic parties, that things should never be written that are contained in Section 4 of the statement, which reads: A state of affairs in which political freedom can be enjoyed without restriction, and bourgeois democracy cannot operate as the dictatorship of capital is, from the viewpoint of the development of the proletarian dictatorship, of the utmost importance in further winning the proletarian masses over to the side of communism. Such a state of affairs is impossible. Petty bourgeois leaders, the German Hendersons, Seidmans, and Snowdens, Crispians, do not and cannot go beyond the bounds of bourgeois democracy, which, in its turn, cannot but be a dictatorship of capital. To achieve the practical results that the Central Committee of the Communist Party had been quite rightly working for, there was no need to write such things, which are wrong in principle and politically harmful. It would have been sufficient to say, if one wished to observe parliamentary amenities, as long as the majority of the urban workers follow the independents, we communists must do nothing to prevent those workers from getting rid of their last Philistine democratic, that is, bourgeois capitalist, illusions by going through the experience of having a government of their own. That is sufficient ground for a compromise, which is really necessary and should consist in renouncing, for a certain period, all attempts at the forcible overthrow of a government which enjoys the confidence of a majority of the urban workers. But in everyday mass agitation, in which one is not bound by official parliamentary amenities, one might, of course, add, let scoundrels like the Seidmans, and Philistines like the Kotskys and Crispians reveal by their deeds how they have been fooled themselves and how they are fooling the workers. Their clean government will itself do the cleanest job of all in cleansing the Augean stables of socialism, social democracy and other forms of social treachery. The real nature of the present leaders of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, leaders of whom it has been wrongly said that they have already lost all influence, whereas in reality they are even more dangerous to the proletariat than the Hungarian Social Democrats who styled themselves communists and promised to support the dictatorship of the proletariat, was once again revealed during the German equivalent of the Kornilov revolt, that is, the Kaplowitz Putsch. A small but striking illustration is provided by two brief articles, one by Karl Kautsky entitled Decisive Hours, Entscheidenstunden, in Freiheit, Freedom, Organ of the Independents, of March 30, 1920, and the other by Arthur Crispian entitled On the Political Situation, in the same newspaper, issue of April 14, 1920. These gentlemen are absolutely incapable of thinking and reasoning like revolutionaries. They are sniveling Philistine Democrats, who become 1,000 times more dangerous to the proletariat when they claim to be supporters of Soviet government and of the dictatorship of the proletariat because, in fact, whenever a difficult and dangerous situation arises they are sure to commit treachery. While sincerely believing that they are helping the proletariat. Did not the Hungarian Social Democrats, after rechristening themselves communists, also want to help the proletariat when, because of their cowardice and spinelessness, they considered the position of Soviet power in Hungary hopeless and went sniveling to the agents of the Entente capitalists and the Entente hangmen? 3. Trotti and Company in Italy. The issues of the Italian newspaper Real Soviet referred to above fully confirm what I have said in the pamphlet about the Italian Socialist Party's error in tolerating such members and even such a group of parliamentarians in their ranks. It is still further confirmed by an outside observer like the Rome correspondent of the Manchester Guardian, organ of the British liberal bourgeoisie, whose interview with Trotti is published in its issue of March 12, 1920. The correspondent writes, Signor Trotti's opinion is that the revolutionary peril is not such as to cause undue anxiety in Italy. The maximalists are fanning the fire of Soviet theories only to keep the masses awake and excited. These theories are, however, merely legendary notions, unripe programs, incapable of being put to practical use. They are likely only to maintain the working classes in a state of expectation. The very men who use them as a lure to dazzle proletarian eyes find themselves compelled to fight a daily battle for the extortion of some often trifling economic advantages so as to delay the moment when the working classes will lose their illusions and faith in their cherished myths. Hence a long string of strikes of all sizes and with all pretexts up to the very latest ones in the mail and railway services, strikes which make the already hard conditions of the country still worse. The country is irritated owing to the difficulties connected with its Adriatic problem, is weighed down by its foreign debt and by its inflated paper circulation, and yet it is still far from realizing the necessity of adopting that discipline of work which alone can restore order and prosperity. It is clear as daylight that this British correspondent has blurted out the truth, which is probably being concealed and glossed over both by Trotsky himself, and his bourgeois defenders, accomplices and inspirers in Italy. That truth is that the ideas and political activities of Trotsky, Trev, Modigliani, Dugoni and company are really and precisely of the kind that the British correspondent has described. It is downright social treachery. Just look at this advocacy of order and discipline among the workers, who are wage slaves toiling to enrich the capitalists. And how familiar to us Russians are all these Menshevik speeches. What a valuable admission it is that the masses are in favor of Soviet government. How stupid and vulgarly bourgeois is the failure to understand the revolutionary role of strikes which are spreading spontaneously. Indeed, the correspondent of the British bourgeois liberal newspaper has rendered Trotsky and company a disservice and has excellently confirmed the correctness of the demand by Comrade Bordiga and his friends on Neo Soviet, who are insisting that the Italian Socialist Party, if it really wants to be for the Third International, should drum Trotsky and company out of its ranks and become a communist party both in name and in deed. 4. False conclusions from correct premises. However, Comrade Bordiga and his left friends draw from their correct criticism of Trotsky and company the wrong conclusion that any participation in parliament is harmful in principle. The Italian lefts cannot advance even a shadow of serious argument in support of this view. They simply do not know, or try to forget, the international examples of really revolutionary and communist utilization of bourgeois parliaments, which has been of unquestionable value in preparing for the proletarian revolution. They simply cannot conceive of any new ways of that utilization, and keep on repeatedly and endlessly vociferating about the old non-Bolshevik way. Herein lies their fundamental error. In all fields of activity, and not in the parliamentary sphere alone, communism must introduce, and without long and persistent effort it will be unable to introduce, something new in principle that will represent a radical break with the traditions of the Second International, while retaining and developing what was good in the latter. Let us take, say, journalistic work. Newspapers, pamphlets and leaflets perform the indispensable work of propaganda, agitation and organization. No mass movement in any country at all civilized can get along without a journalistic apparatus. No outcries against leaders or solemn vows to keep the masses uncontaminated by the influence of leaders will relieve us of the necessity of using, for this work, people from a bourgeois intellectual environment, or will rid us of the bourgeois democratic, private property atmosphere and environment in which this work is carried out under capitalism. Even 2.5 years after the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, after the conquest of political power by the proletariat, we still have this atmosphere around us, this environment of mass, peasant, artisan, bourgeois democratic private property relations. Parliamentarianism is one form of activity, journalism is another. The content of both can and should be communist if those engaged in these two spheres are genuine communists, really members of a proletarian mass party. Yet, in neither sphere, and in no other sphere of activity under capitalism and during the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, is it possible to avoid those difficulties which the proletariat must overcome, those special problems which the proletariat must solve so as to use, for its own purposes, the services of people from the ranks of the bourgeoisie, eradicate bourgeois intellectualist prejudices and influences, and weaken the resistance of, and, ultimately, completely transform, the petty bourgeois environment. Did we not, before the war of 1914–18, witness in all countries innumerable cases of extreme left anarchists, syndicalists and others fulminating against parliamentarianism, deriding bourgeois vulgarized parliamentary socialists, castigating their careerism, and so on and so forth, and yet themselves pursuing the same kind of bourgeois career through journalism and through work in the syndicates, trade unions? Is not the example of Jew Hawks and Mrayem, to limit oneself to France, typical in this respect? The childishness of those who repudiate participation in parliament consists in their thinking it possible to solve the difficult problem of combating bourgeois democratic influences within the working class movement in such a simple, easy, allegedly revolutionary manner, whereas they are actually merely running away from their own shadows, only closing their eyes to difficulties and trying to shrug them off with mere words. The most shameless careerism, the bourgeois utilization of parliamentary seats, glaringly reformist perversion of parliamentary activity, and vulgar petty bourgeois conservatism are all unquestionably common and prevalent features engendered everywhere by capitalism, not only outside but also within the working class movement. But the selfsame capitalism and the bourgeois environment it creates, which disappears very slowly even after the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, since the peasantry constantly regenerates the bourgeoisie, give rise to what is essentially the same bourgeois careerism, national chauvinism, petty bourgeois vulgarity, etc. Merely varying insignificantly in form, in positively every sphere of activity and life. You think, my dear boycottists and anti-parliamentarians, that you are terribly revolutionary, but in reality you are frightened by the comparatively minor difficulties of the struggle against bourgeois influences within the working class movement, whereas your victory, that is, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the conquest of political power by the proletariat, will create these very same difficulties on a still larger, an infinitely larger scale. Like children, you are frightened by a minor difficulty which confronts you today, but you do not understand that tomorrow, and the day after, you will still have to learn, and learn thoroughly, to overcome the self-same difficulties, only on an immeasurably greater scale. Under Soviet rule, your proletarian party and ours will be invaded by a still larger number of bourgeois intellectuals. They will worm their way into the Soviets, the courts, and the administration, since communism cannot be built otherwise than with the aid of the human material created by capitalism, and the bourgeois intellectuals cannot be expelled and destroyed, but must be won over, remolded, assimilated and re-educated, just as we must, in a protracted struggle waged on the basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat, re-educate the proletarians themselves, who do not abandon their petty bourgeois prejudices at one stroke, by a miracle, at the behest of the Virgin Mary, at the behest of a slogan, resolution or decree, but only in the course of a long and difficult mass struggle against mass petty bourgeois influences. Under Soviet rule, these same problems, which the anti-parliamentarians now so proudly, so haughtily, so lightly and so childishly brush aside with a wave of the hand, these self-same problems are rising anew within the Soviets, within the Soviet administration among the Soviet leaders. In Russia we have abolished, and have rightly abolished, the bourgeois legal bar, but it is reviving again under the cover of the Soviet leaders. 40. Among Soviet engineers, Soviet school teachers and the privileged, that is, the most highly skilled and best situated, workers at Soviet factories, we observe a constant revival of absolutely all the negative traits peculiar to bourgeois parliamentarianism, and we are conquering this evil, gradually, only by a tireless, prolonged and persistent struggle based on proletarian organization and discipline. Of course, under the rule of the bourgeoisie it is very difficult to eradicate bourgeois habits from our own, that is, the workers' party. It is difficult to expel from the party the familiar parliamentary leaders who have been hopelessly corrupted by bourgeois prejudices. It is difficult to subject to proletarian discipline the absolutely essential, even if very limited, number of people coming from the ranks of the bourgeoisie. It is difficult to form, in a bourgeois parliament, a communist group fully worthy of the working class. It is difficult to ensure that the communist parliamentarians do not engage in bourgeois parliamentary inanities, but concern themselves with the very urgent work of propaganda, agitation and organization among the masses. All this is difficult, to be sure. It was difficult in Russia, and it is vastly more difficult in Western Europe and in America, where the bourgeoisie is far stronger, where bourgeois democratic traditions are stronger, and so on. Yet all these difficulties are mere child's play compared with the same sort of problems which, in any event, the proletariat will have most certainly to solve in order to achieve victory, both during the proletarian revolution and after the seizure of power by the proletariat. Compared with these truly gigantic problems of re-educating, under the proletarian dictatorship, millions of peasants and small proprietors, hundreds of thousands of office employees, officials and bourgeois intellectuals, of subordinating them all to the proletarian state and to proletarian leadership, of eradicating their bourgeois habits and traditions. Compared with these gigantic problems, it is childishly easy to create, under the rule of the bourgeoisie, and in a bourgeois parliament, a really communist group of a real proletarian party. If our left and anti-parliamentarian comrades do not learn to overcome even such a small difficulty now, we may safely assert that either they will prove incapable of achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat, and will be unable to subordinate and remold the bourgeois intellectuals and bourgeois institutions on a wide scale, or they will have to hastily complete their education, and, by that haste, will do a great deal of harm to the cause of the proletariat, will commit more errors than usual, will manifest more than average weakness and inefficiency, and so on and so forth, until the bourgeoisie has been overthrown and, after that, until small-scale economy and small commodity production have entirely disappeared, the bourgeois atmosphere, proprietary habits and petty bourgeois traditions will hamper proletarian work both outside and within the working-class movement, not only in a single field of activity, the parliamentary, but, inevitably, in every field of social activity, in all cultural and political spheres without exception. The attempt to brush aside, to fence oneself off from one of the unpleasant problems or difficulties in someone's sphere of activity is a profound mistake, which will later most certainly have to be paid for. We must learn how to master every sphere of work and activity without exception, to overcome all difficulties and eradicate all bourgeois habits, customs and traditions everywhere. Any other way of presenting the question is just trifling, mere childishness. May 12, 1920. V. In the Russian edition of this book I somewhat incorrectly describe the conduct of the Communist Party of Holland as a whole, in the sphere of international revolutionary policy. I therefore avail myself of the present opportunity to publish a letter from our Dutch comrades on this question and to correct the expression Dutch tribunists, which I used in the Russian text, and for which I now substitute the words certain members of the Communist Party of Holland. 41. N. Lenin. Letter from Wijnkoop. Moscow, June 30, 1920. Dear Comrade Lenin. Thanks to your kindness, we members of the Dutch delegation to the Second Congress of the Communist International were able to read your left-wing Communism, an infantile disorder prior to its publication in the European languages. In several places in the book you emphasize your disapproval of the part played by some members of the Communist Party of Holland in international politics. We feel, nevertheless, that we must protest against your laying the responsibility for their actions on the Communist Party. This is highly inaccurate. Moreover, it is unjust, because these members of the Communist Party of Holland take little or no part in the party's current activities and are endeavoring, directly or indirectly, to give effect, in the Communist Party of Holland, to opposition slogans against which the party and all its organs have waged, and continue to wage to this day, a most energetic struggle. Fraternally yours. D. J. Wijnkoop. On behalf of the Dutch delegation,